You are now listening to the Vegan Stuff podcast with Caavakushi.
Hosting this podcast today are our two AI hosts, Sam and Kim. If you simply can't get enough of us, go to Caavakushi.com and sign up for our vegan newsletter and get our free 7-day high-protein vegan meal plan. And we also have some good news. We will be releasing our first ever cookbook pretty soon, so stay tuned. Hey, don't forget to follow us on our socials too.
Imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting at a table, you're enjoying a perfectly normal, everyday lunch, right?
Yeah, just minding your own business.
Exactly. Catching up on emails, or maybe just staring out the window. And on your plate is something completely mundane, like a simple ham and cheese sandwich. It's quiet, it's routine, it's an action you've taken, literally thousands of times without a second thought. But then suddenly the whole atmosphere just fractures.
Totally shatters.
Right. Someone walks straight up to your table, completely bypassing all the normal social cues, points directly at your plate, and tells you with his absolute unflinching conviction that you aren't eating lunch. You are eating a corpse.
Wow. Yeah.
You are participating in a systemic atrocity. And that jarring, deeply uncomfortable disruption of normal life, that sudden collision where your everyday unthinking habits smash into someone else's absolute moral outrage, that is the exact friction we are plunging into today. Welcome to a brand new deep dive on vegan stuff with Caavakushi. I'm your host, Sam.
And I'm your resident expert, Kim.
And since our target audience here is vegan, we obviously know the baseline arguments, right? But today, we are looking at this from a totally analytical angle.
Yeah, it's a profound, almost violent collision of realities when you really look at it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as a society, we really like our moral choices to be heavily insulated. We want them clean, packaged, and neatly separated from our daily routines.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Precisely. But when a disruptive figure steps into that insulated space and deliberately shatters the separation between what you consume and how it was produced, it forces this immediate, visceral reaction.
It really does.
It is incredibly uncomfortable for the listener, but from a sociological standpoint, it is a masterclass in exposing the invisible boundaries of our societal norms.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the stack of sources we have in front of us today, it reads less like a standard informational dossier and way more like a psychological thriller.
It really is wild. The range of material is it's staggering.
It is. We are tracing a narrative through a genuinely chaotic spectrum of media. We're jumping from police records hinting at early criminal activity to, explosive headlines in tabloid powerhouses like The Mirror and Metro.
Right, the real sensational stuff.
Exactly. And then straight into chaotic live broadcasting clashes on This Morning and the BBC. But then the narrative suddenly swerves.
Yeah. It takes a sharp left turn.
It goes into independent undercover documentaries, celebrity pop culture news, and somehow ends up in the hallowed, hyper-academic debating halls of Oxford University.
Which is quite the leap.
It's a massive leap. And all of these disparate, seemingly unconnected sources revolve tightly around one of the most polarizing figures in modern animal rights activism, Joey Carbstrong.
He really is a lightning rod.
He is. And our mission today is to objectively dissect his methodology. We are going to examine how a radical activist operates, how the modern media ecosystem weaponizes that activism for its own ends, and what this intense societal friction reveals about how we collectively navigate the realities of animal agriculture.
What's fascinating here is how a single individual can act as an ideological stress test for an entire culture.
Oh, I like that phrase. Ideological stress test.
Yeah, because if you read through these sources, you are immediately confronted with two completely incompatible versions of the exact same human being.
Right. It depends entirely on who you're asking.
Exactly. To his supporters and within his own framework, he is a vital, unapologetic, ethical crusader. He is the person finally willing to say the quiet parts out loud, no matter the personal cost.
Yeah, someone has to do the dirty work.
But to others, and certainly to his detractors in the agricultural sector, the media, and honestly, even within more moderate vegan circles, he is a militant extremist, someone who actively damages the cause he claims to serve.
Right. Some people think he's going way too far. And I just want to remind you, the listener, our goal today is strictly observational. We are not here to endorse the politics of his crusade or the outrage of his detractors. We are here to just impartially report on the content provided in these sources and look at the mechanics of the friction itself.
It's all about the mechanics.
Exactly. Because if you just watch the shouting matches on daytime TV, you miss the architecture behind the noise. We have to start at the foundation to understand why the noise is happening in the first place.
Which means looking at where he came from.
Right. So let's look at his origin story. The sources point out a stark personal evolution. An article from Live Kindly specifically highlights his background, tracking a journey from, quote, criminal activity to vegan activist.
Which obviously is not your standard pipeline into animal rights.
Not at all. Most people, they watch a documentary or read a book. They don't usually come from that kind of background. But the true key to this is found in an article from the South China Morning Post.
Oh, that piece is crucial.
It really is. It explicitly outlines his core philosophical operating system. The article details his belief in the absolute myth of humane slaughter. But more importantly, and this is the engine driving everything we will discuss today, it highlights his belief that vegans have a literal, active obligation to convert meat eaters.
We really need to pause and look at that phrase, obligation to convert.
Yeah, it's a heavy phrase.
It is, because it's the master key to understanding his entire tactical playbook. If we examine the psychology of radical conversion, a very specific pattern often emerges.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, when an individual undergoes a profound personal transformation, especially when they are leaving behind a chaotic or destructive past, like a background involving the criminal justice system, they rarely transition into a state of moderate passive neutrality.
Right, they don't just become quietly content.
Exactly. Instead, they often adopt a highly rigid, zero-tolerance ethical framework. The world transitions from subjective shades of gray into absolute, undeniable black and white.
So it's all or nothing.
Totally all or nothing. Within Carbstrong's framework, as documented in these sources, veganism is entirely decoupled from the concept of a dietary preference.
Right, it's not a diet.
No, it is an absolute moral baseline.
I want to pull the listener into this for a second because understanding that mindset is just so crucial. Think about a time in your own life when you had a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah, like a light bulb moment.
Right. Maybe you realized a relationship was deeply toxic, or you uncovered a lie you'd believed for years. You know that overwhelming, almost frantic feeling of wanting to shake everyone around you and say, how do you not see this?
Oh, yeah. It's consuming.
It feels very much like a recovering addict mentality or like a sudden religious awakening. When you have had a wake-up moment that completely redirects your life trajectory, there's this huge psychological demand that the rest of the world must also wake up to the reality you've just discovered.
You can't just unsee it.
Exactly. You can't just quietly eat your tofu while you believe the world is burning around you. You have to actively intervene. But here's where I get hung up.
What's that?
Does treating veganism as a moral imperative rather than just a personal choice fundamentally rewrite the rules of societal engagement?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because if you believe you have a literal obligation to convert people, does the concept of polite conversation just completely fly out the window?
It doesn't just fly out the window. It is actively targeted for destruction.
Wow. Targeted for destruction.
Yes, because if you view animal agriculture not as a problematic food system, but as a systemic moral atrocity occurring in plain sight, then politeness is essentially complicity.
Oh, man. Politeness is complicity. That is intense.
It is. Politeness maintains the status quo. And we see this operationalized directly in his strategic choices on the ground.
Give me an example from the sources.
Well, look at the material detailing his investigations. He doesn't just target the massive, faceless, multinational factory farms that the general public already agrees are distasteful.
Right, the easy targets.
Exactly. The sources show him specifically launching investigations into small, family-run slaughterhouses.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that is a highly deliberate tactical calculation. He is going after the public's comfort zone.
I see what you mean. It's like he's intentionally bypassing the easy target to hit the emotional one because, people desperately want to buy, the locally sourced free-range product from the smiling farmer down the road.
Right, so they can feel ethically insulated about their lunch.
Exactly. And he is stepping directly into that carefully curated space and saying, no, this is a myth. The scale of the operation does not sanitize the act of slaughter. He is stripping away the ethical free pass that the public relies on.
Precisely. He is insisting that if the end result is the taking of a life, the family-run nature of the business is irrelevant to the victim.
Right. The animal doesn't care if it's a family business.
Exactly. It is incredibly confrontational because it targets the very mechanisms we use to sleep well at night.
But hold on. If your worldview demands that you must force people to look at their food differently, and you are actively dismantling their ethical comfort zones, a small-town protest isn't going to cut it.
No, you need a much bigger stage.
Right. You need a massive megaphone. And historically, how do radical movements get a megaphone before they have mainstream legitimacy? They have to create a spectacle.
They do.
You don't get millions of eyeballs by quietly handing out trifold pamphlets in a town square. You have to hijack the platforms where the eyeballs already are.
Which leads us directly into the mechanics of the modern media circus.
The circus.
Because the mainstream media ecosystem is the perfect, volatile arena for this exact type of activism.
And the sources provide some utterly surreal examples of how this symbiotic relationship plays out. Let's look at the Jeremy Vine sandwich incident.
Oh, this one is just wild.
It really is. On paper, it sounds like a forgotten comedy sketch. Tabloid powerhouses like The Mirror and Metro both ran pieces on this bizarre moment at the BBC.
Right, at a major broadcasting hub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Broadcaster Jeremy Vine apparently had a standard ham and cheese sandwich left out in his radio studio.
Just sitting there on the desk.
Just sitting there. And Joey Carbstrong, who was there for an interview, completely halts the proceedings to call him out on it.
Hmm?
And the specific language quoted in the source is critical here.
What did he say?
He doesn't say, hey, I'd appreciate it if you put your lunch away. He points at it and says, quote, it's dead animal flesh.
We really have to analyze the linguistic shift happening in that studio.
Yeah, break that down for me.
Because it perfectly illustrates the cognitive dissonance between the radical activist and the general public. To Jeremy Vine, to the studio producers, and to the millions of people scrolling past that headline on their phones, that object on the desk is just a sandwich.
Right, it's just lunch.
It is the concept of lunch. It is entirely mundane. But to Carbstrong, operating from his absolute moral baseline, he isn't looking at lunch.
What is he looking at?
He is looking at the literal, fragmented body parts of a victim. By using the phrase dead animal flesh, he is actively attempting to shatter the linguistic euphemism of the word ham.
Man, it's a forced perspective shift. It's like pulling the neat plastic packaging off a product and forcing the consumer to stare at the slaughterhouse floor. But it's not just sandwiches in radio studios.
No, it goes much further than that.
The sources highlight an escalating pattern of these massive, heated live television debates. Like, there was a highly publicized clash on This Morning featuring Carbstrong going toe-to-toe with a farmer.
That was intense.
It was. And then we hit what might be the peak absurdity of the media sources, an interaction with Piers Morgan.
Oh, Piers Morgan, of course.
Right. A piece from the Canary details Piers Morgan literally comparing vegans to terrorists during a heated on-air debate.
Terrorists over a debate on dairy.
Exactly. The topic of this debate was milk. They were arguing over the ethics of dairy, and it escalated to the word terrorist.
Right.
You could say they were really milking the controversy there.
Yeah, they definitely were. But seriously, if we connect this to the broader sociological picture, we are witnessing the deeply cynical yet highly effective symbiotic relationship between radical activists and the media ecosystem.
Symbiotic how?
Well, shows like This Morning and broadcasters like Piers Morgan, they operate on a very specific business model. Their entire broadcast architecture thrives on high-emotion, high-friction conflict.
They want the drama.
Exactly. They do not invite a controversial activist onto their show to facilitate a nuanced academic discussion about agricultural policy or supply chain ethics.
Obviously not. That would be boring TV.
Right. They invite them because the inevitable explosion, the shouting matches, the pure, unadulterated outrage. That is the exact currency of viral television. The media uses the activist as a prop to generate engagement and ratings.
Let me push back on that framing, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Is Carbstrong simply a prop being used by the media, or is this like asymmetrical media warfare where he is actively using them right back?
That's a fair point.
Because, yes, the network gets their viral clip. But in exchange, Carbstrong gets his core message beamed directly into the living rooms of millions of people who would otherwise never seek out an animal rights perspective.
It's a trade-off.
It is. But here's the trap, and this is what I want to ask you. When you are sitting under the studio lights and a host like Piers Morgan is calling you a terrorist over a glass of milk, are you actually successfully spreading a coherent ethical framework? Or have you just become a convenient, cartoonish punchline in a broader culture war? Does the extremity of the platform completely obliterate the message?
That is the perpetual, precarious tightrope of radical activism. In media theory, we talk about trading personal likability for issue visibility.
Visibility over likability. Interesting.
Yeah. On one hand, Carbstrong is successfully penetrating the mainstream consciousness. Millions of viewers who are completely insulated from animal rights discourse are suddenly watching a debate about the ethics of dairy on their morning television show.
Right. They can't ignore it.
He is dragging the topic onto the public agenda by force. However, the severe cost of that visibility is that the message is instantly filtered through a pre-existing lens of mockery and outrage.
I see. So the audience is already primed to reject him.
Exactly. The term terrorist, as utterly hyperbolic and mathematically absurd as it is in the context of drinking milk, is a calculated rhetorical weapon.
It's designed to shut him down.
It is used specifically by the broadcaster to frame the activist not as a valid moral voice, but as an existential threat to everyday normalcy. Yeah. It gives the audience permission to dismiss the activist entirely.
And the audience loves that dismissal because it protects their comfort zone. They don't have to change their habits if the guy telling them to is a terrorist.
Right. It lets them off the hook.
But before we move on, let's take a quick breather to just process that. It's a lot of heavy media theory.
It is, yeah.
Okay, but here is where the narrative takes a very dark turn. This high-stakes inflammatory language isn't just something TV hosts throw at him to get ratings.
No, it goes both ways.
Right. According to the sources, this escalation in rhetoric is actually a direct reflection of the genuinely extreme, deeply controversial language that Carbstrong himself weaponizes on the ground.
And this is where it gets really complicated.
It does. This brings us to the most uncomfortable aspect of our deep dive today. And I need to be very clear to you, the listener. We are strictly reporting the contents of the source material here because the terminology gets incredibly intense and highly sensitive. We aren't taking sides.
Yes, this is where the discourse moves away from performative television theatrics and translates into real-world, highly damaging accusations and consequences.
Exactly. The sources document Carbstrong utilizing analogies that are clearly engineered to be as shocking and deeply offensive to societal norms as possible.
Like what?
Well, articles from the Mirror and Metro highlight instances of him publicly calling the artificial insemination of cows rape.
That is an incredibly heavy word to use.
It is. He is actively, on record, defended the comparison of dairy farmers to rapists. It escalates even further. One report explicitly juxtaposes the phrase peaceful vegan activist with detailed allegations that he compared dairy farmers to Hitler.
Hitler.
Wow. Yeah, and allegedly told them to kill themselves. And this isn't just shouting into the void, right? There is tangible, real-world fallout from this.
There always is with language like that.
The Independent reported on a specific incident where Carbstrong confronted a farming couple. Following that highly publicized confrontation, that specific couple became the target of severe harassment and received death threats.
Death threats over farming. That is intense.
It is. And this direct chain of events led the Independent to publish an article explicitly posing the question, vegans hurt their case by being too extreme.
We really must dissect the mechanics behind the strategic use of this taboo language, rather than just reacting to the shock value.
Yeah, break it down from his perspective.
Well, words like rape, Hitler, murderers, these are unequivocally the most highly charged, emotionally devastating, and culturally protected words in the human vocabulary.
Absolutely.
From the activist's internal perspective, deploying this language is entirely logically consistent. Think about it. If you operate from the absolute belief that animals are sentient beings deserving of the exact same moral consideration and bodily autonomy as human beings, then forcing a cow to breed against her will, or systematically orchestrating the slaughter of millions of animals in gas chambers,
logically equates to those extreme terms.
Exactly, within their philosophical framework. The activist uses these words intentionally to shatter the sanitized euphemisms of the agricultural industry.
They want to break the illusion.
Right. They want to force society to look at the mechanical severity of the exploitation without the comfortable psychological buffer of words like livestock processing or harvesting.
I understand the internal logic, I really do. But step outside the activist bubble for a second.
Okay.
Put yourself in the shoes of the average person scrolling through the news, or better yet, put yourself in the shoes of that farming couple.
That's a terrifying position to be in.
Right. If your stated goal, your absolute self-proclaimed obligation, is to convert meat eaters to your cause, how does this tactic actually work?
That's the paradox.
If you attack a small-town farming couple to the point where an internet mob is sending them death threats, aren't you instantly alienating the exact public you are supposedly trying to win over?
Sociologically speaking, yes.
Think about it. If someone stood next to you right now and called you a murderer, your first instinct wouldn't be to thoughtfully evaluate their ethical argument.
No, you'd be furious.
Your brain would instantly flood with cortisol, your defensive walls would slant up, and you would write them off as a dangerous fanatic. You aren't forcing the public to look at the animals suffering, you are just forcing them to look at you as an extremist. Doesn't the human hostility completely overwrite the message of animal compassion?
That tension is the exact core of the independence argument. And it represents a fundamental ongoing debate within the sociology of any social movement.
It's a massive debate.
From a purely psychological perspective, extreme accusatory language often completely short-circuits the listener's ability to process the underlying message.
Right, they just stop listening.
It bypasses the logical centers of the brain and triggers an immediate tribal defensive response. When a small farming family receives death threats, the general public naturally and immediately rallies around them out of human empathy.
Because they see them as human victims.
Exactly. In that narrative, the farmer becomes the victim, and the activist is cast as the aggressive villain. The paradox we are observing here is profound.
It really is.
You have an individual fighting for what they view as the ultimate expression of peace and compassion for animals, yet they are utilizing a methodology that generates immense, palpable human hostility and psychological suffering.
It's a massive, glaring contradiction. I mean, you literally have a headline referring to him as a peaceful vegan activist, parked right next to allegations of death threats and Hitler comparisons.
It is incredibly messy.
Very messy. But if we stopped the deep dive right here, we would be missing the most surprising part of the story.
Because the story doesn't end on daytime TV.
No, it doesn't. Because what's really compelling in our sources is that while these street-level confrontations and chaotic TV shouting matches are generating all this massive public backlash, there's a simultaneous tactical evolution happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, a very strategic evolution.
Right. Carbstrong isn't just permanently stuck on a street corner screaming at farmers. The sources reveal a major, sophisticated pivot towards structured, undeniable forms of exposure.
Yes, if you analyze the timeline of the sources, you see a distinct tactical maturation.
Maturation, yeah.
The strategy shifts from purely individual verbal confrontation to highly organized systemic investigations and media production.
Exactly. We're looking at a hard pivot into long-form documentaries and physical direct action. The sources detail the massive effort behind the release of his undercover documentary, Pignorant, which is specifically designed to expose the hidden realities of the pork industry.
That documentary made huge waves.
It really did. We also see reports detailing a shocking undercover investigation into a UK turkey farm. I guess you could say he was forcing the public to go cold turkey on their ignorance.
Ah, nice one. But yeah, the impact of that footage is undeniable.
And then you have these deeply intense physical actions that require immense coordination. A report from Vegan Food and Living describes Joey Carbstrong and a team of activists physically occupying what they describe as a torturous abattoir.
That takes serious planning.
It does. The Northern Echo details him standing shoulder to shoulder with other activists during an organized vigil outside an abattoir in Spennymoor. And then, in a completely different strategic lane, the sources note him targeting the pop superstar Ed Sheeran.
That was a brilliant move, tactically speaking.
It was. When Ed Sheeran publicly unveiled his new Christmas menu, Carbstrong immediately leveraged that pop culture moment to publicly urge Sheeran and his millions of fans to watch the Pignorant documentary.
This specific grouping of sources raises an incredibly important question about the measurable efficacy of different forms of activism.
Yeah, let's dig into that.
There is a vast mechanical difference between shouting at a radio host over a ham sandwich and producing long-form, undercover investigative journalism.
Night and day difference.
When an activist releases a documentary like Pignorant or successfully publishes raw, unfiltered footage from inside a biosecure turkey farm, they are radically changing the rules of engagement.
Because they have proof.
Exactly. They are providing tangible visual evidence. They are deliberately moving the debate away from the realm of subjective morality, where people can endlessly argue about whether a specific farmer is a good person or whether an analogy is deeply offensive, and forcing the debate onto the undeniable ground of objective reality.
You can't argue with what's right in front of your eyes.
The methodology shifts from listen to my outrage to don't take my word for it, look at the unedited footage of the gas chambers.
And it is nearly impossible to argue with raw footage. But I want to explore the concept of the Abattoir vigil you mentioned, because it feels like a total emotional contrast to everything else we've discussed so far.
It's a completely different energy.
Right. From what the sources describe, these vigils involve activists quietly standing outside slaughterhouses, bearing witness to the animals arriving in transport trucks. It is a form of nonviolent, deeply emotional, direct action.
Very somber.
Exactly. It isn't about screaming at a camera. It is about physical, somber presence. It operates on a completely different emotional frequency than the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled noise of a daytime talk show.
The sociology of the vigil is fascinating because it serves a critical dual purpose for the movement.
What are the two purposes?
Well, internally, for the activists themselves, it acts as a point of deep community solidarity and functions almost as a form of collective mourning.
Right. They need that support system.
Exactly. It reinforces their emotional commitment to the cause in the face of overwhelming societal apathy. But externally, it operates as a stark visual disruption in the local community.
Ah, I see.
Imagine you are driving your normal route to work in Spennymoor. You drive past an industrial building every day and completely ignore it. But suddenly, there is a somber crowd of people holding vigil outside its gates.
You have to stop and wonder what's going on.
That physical presence pierces the invisibility of the meat industry. It takes an industrial process that society has carefully hidden on the outskirts of town and makes the invisible visible. It forces the local community to acknowledge what is happening inside the walls they drive past every day.
I love that framing, making the invisible visible. And speaking of visibility, we have to talk about the tactic of targeting Ed Sheeran's Christmas menu, because it is brilliant from a modern media perspective.
Oh, it's textbook modern campaigning.
It operates exactly like digital guerrilla marketing. If you release a heavy, traumatic, undercover documentary about the pork industry, you know that organic reach is fundamentally limited.
Because nobody wants to watch trauma on their lunch break.
Right. The general public does not actively search for trauma. But if you take that heavy investigative work and you strategically latch it onto the cultural momentum of one of the biggest pop stars on the planet during the holiday season, you are essentially hijacking the algorithm.
It's forced engagement.
Yes. You are using Ed Sheeran's massive celebrity gravity to pull your investigative work out of the activist echo chamber and force it into mainstream pop culture news feeds.
It is a highly sophisticated, asymmetrical media tactic. You are intentionally inserting a deeply uncomfortable hidden reality into a cultural space traditionally reserved for celebration, comfort, and unthinking consumption.
Disrupting holidays.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this specific strategy of infiltrating mainstream culture, of intentionally dragging the conversation from the radical fringes to the absolute center of the cultural zeitgeist, appears to be yielding some highly surprising, documented results.
Which is the perfect bridge into our final core theme: institutional victories and genuine cultural influence. Because I think you only read the first half of our sources.
The tabloid stuff.
Yeah, if you only looked at the intense controversies, the Piers Morgan fights, the deeply offensive language, and the police records, you would naturally assume this radical approach is entirely self-defeating.
You'd think he was just spinning his wheels.
Right. You'd think it just creates noise and alienates everyone. But the sources provide undeniable, high-profile markers of success that actually legitimize Carbstrong's abrasive approach.
This is where we see the ultimate stress test of the obligation to convert philosophy. The crucial question is, does all this abrasive friction actually produce measurable systemic change?
According to the sources, the answer is undeniably yes. We have two massive paradigm-shifting examples.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, Joey Carbstrong and a team of vegans entered a formal debate at the highly prestigious Oxford University. The motion of the debate was, "This house would go vegan." And they won.
They won the debate at Oxford.
They won. They successfully convinced the audience. Second, a specific report details that the mega-selling singer James Arthur transitioned from a plant-based diet to an ethical vegan. And he specifically credited activist Joey Carbstrong for that profound shift.
That is huge.
So let's pause and really think about this. How does someone who was literally labeled a terrorist on national television, who is routinely blasted as a dangerous militant by daytime TV viewers, end up walking into the hallowed, hyper-intellectual halls of the Oxford Union and winning a formal, rigorous debate? How does that math work?
It works because it forces us to acknowledge the vital difference between the medium of activism and the underlying message.
Break that down.
Well, the chaotic media appearances, the shocking tabloid headlines, and the extreme street-level activism, those are the battering rams.
Battering rams, I like that.
They are blunt instruments designed to break down the door of societal apathy and force the mainstream culture to acknowledge that a debate is even happening.
Getting a foot in the door.
Exactly. However, once that door is broken down, once you are standing at the podium at Oxford University, the battering ram is useless.
You can't just shout at Oxford students.
No, you can't. At that point, the underlying philosophy, the core ethical arguments against animal exploitation, must be logically robust enough to withstand the highest levels of academic scrutiny. Winning that debate at Oxford demonstrates a crucial reality.
Which is?
When you strip away the tabloid outrage, the screaming matches, and the inflammatory rhetoric, the core ethical architecture of veganism carries significant, undeniable intellectual weight.
That is a fascinating distinction. The battering ram gets you into the room, but the logic wins the room.
Precisely.
And the James Arthur example is just as telling, maybe even more so, for understanding how this impacts the general public. The source makes a very specific, deliberate distinction here. James Arthur didn't just change his diet. He transitioned from a plant-based diet to an ethical vegan.
We must break down the mechanics of that specific linguistic difference because it completely validates Carbstrong's overarching worldview.
The difference between plant-based and vegan.
Yes. A plant-based diet is merely a consumer choice. It is often driven by personal health metrics or generalized environmental concerns. It is passive, and it can be abandoned when it becomes inconvenient.
Right, it's just what you eat.
But ethical veganism, exactly as Carbstrong aggressively promotes it, is an absolute moral baseline that fundamentally rejects the commodity status of animals entirely.
It's a whole worldview.
It is. It dictates not just what you eat, but what you wear, the entertainment you consume, and how you view humanity's relationship with the natural world.
So it's much deeper.
For a celebrity with massive cultural influence to publicly credit Carbstrong for causing that specific, deep philosophical shift, that is the ultimate proof of concept for his obligation to convert methodology.
Wow.
It proves that the confrontational, unapologetic approach didn't just cause defensiveness, it actually resonated, pierced the cognitive dissonance, and caused a profound internal paradigm shift.
And I keep coming back to the alternate reality. I mean, I have to ask, could Carbstrong have achieved this?
Achieved what, specifically?
Could he have reached the Oxford Union podium or systematically converted major musicians if he had just played nice? If he had just politely asked people to eat more vegetables on Mondays or quietly handed out pleasant recipes?
It's highly unlikely.
Right. Or is the chaotic, controversial, highly offensive noise an absolute necessary prerequisite to getting a seat at the elite table in today's media landscape? It's such an incredible, almost dizzying duality to wrap your head around.
It really is.
Picture the visceral, muddy, emotionally agonizing reality of physically occupying an abattoir in Spennymoor, standing in the freezing rain in front of a slaughterhouse truck. And then contrast that raw, gritty image with standing at a polished wooden podium in the academic halls of Oxford, debating ethical philosophy in a tuxedo.
The contrast is unbelievable.
The fact that the exact same person is executing both of those actions and mathematically using the momentum and notoriety from the street to achieve victory in the academy is just a masterclass in the bizarre complexities of modern activism.
It represents a phenomenal, highly calculated synthesis of tactical extremes.
Tactical extremes.
He is intentionally utilizing the extreme, unpalatable edges of public discourse to generate the sheer energy and hypervisibility required to operate effectively and ultimately win in the intellectual and cultural center.
It really is a masterful, if controversial, strategy. So let's pull all these threads together and synthesize everything we've unpacked from this wild stack of sources today.
Sounds good.
Joey Carbstrong's story. as it is laid out across tabloids, police reports, and academic journals, just defies a simple, comfortable narrative. He is not easily categorized as a pure hero or a one-dimensional villain.
Not at all.
His trajectory is a complex study in the mechanics of friction. He is a figure who deliberately utilizes shocking, taboo comparisons, who aggressively courts intense and sometimes vicious media backlash, and whose actions are directly linked to the severe harassment of everyday farming families.
The messy reality of radicalism.
Exactly. Yet, simultaneously and undeniably, he produces highly effective, deep-dive investigative journalism. He successfully converts cultural icons to rigorous ethical frameworks, and he wins over the intellectual elite at the highest levels of academia.
And examining that intense duality leaves you with a lingering and perhaps deeply uncomfortable historical question to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
I love a good lingering question. Lay it on us.
Well, in sociology, we constantly monitor the Overton window, which is the specific range of ideas, policies, and discourse that is considered politically and socially acceptable to the mainstream population at any given time.
Right. What's normal to talk about.
Exactly. If you look closely at history, whether it is the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, or early labor rights, you see a consistent pattern.
The troublemakers.
Yes. These massive societal shifts often succeeded precisely because of their most polarizing, difficult, and universally hated figures. They were the individuals who refused to be polite, who dragged the Overton window of acceptable discourse by force, utilizing sheer friction, discomfort, and disruption.
So they force society to look.
Exactly. So when society looks back at the animal rights movement in 50 or 100 years, how will figures like Joey Carbstrong be categorized?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Will they be viewed as detrimental, aggressive extremists who alienated the public and unnecessarily traumatized individuals? Or will historical hindsight view them as the harsh, unapologetic, and absolutely necessary disruptors who finally generated enough friction to break through the noise of societal apathy?
Wow. That is the perfect provocative thought to leave you with today. Which side of history does the friction serve? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on vegan stuff with Caavakushi into the sources, the intense controversy, and the complex mechanics of radical societal change.
It's been quite the journey.
It really has. Keep questioning the narratives around you. Keep looking closer at the things that make you uncomfortable. And always stay curious.
Thanks for listening. We hope you liked this episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Also, we would be so appreciative if you could just share this episode or this podcast with all your friends and family who are vegans or vegan friendly. We're also really excited because we are going to be launching something really cool pretty soon on the site, so keep an eye out for that. And we will see you really soon with a new episode.